A few weeks ago, my nephew asked me the question, how can he make his photos look more nostalgic, more retro? And when I quizzed him on what he meant by that, he pulled his phone out and he showed me loads of examples of images on Instagram and on Google image search, which, in my opinion, were all kind of crap images, basically, very heavily edited, and I guess if I were to summarize the look, it was sort of shot on disposable cameras from the mid 80s and 90s, often using that direct flash, that very unfavourable look for most photographers, very grainy, that kind of film look. And this really got me thinking, because whilst objectively speaking these photos are low quality, subjectively there's no doubt that when you're scrolling Instagram, when you're looking at the preset packs that people are pushing these days, there's definitely a drive towards this nostalgic look. So obviously, wanting to be a good uncle, I started doing a little bit digging about how I could achieve this nostalgic look beyond just applying a Lightroom preset. And my research led me to this. Now, this is the Retropia disposable camera lens, and it's a really cheap item. It's made of plastic, and it's essentially just a repurposed disposable camera lens put into essentially a body cap for your camera. This particular one is E-mount because I shoot Sony. And let's make no mistake about this. This is absolute garbage. You know, we spend loads of money on our cameras these days to get high quality imagery. So it seems totally counterproductive to then throw this £30 piece of plastic onto our cameras to reduce the image quality that we're getting. But I must admit that I put this on to my camera. I actually put it onto this, the 6400, the A6400, and was just immediately intrigued by the results that I was getting. So this lens has no focus. It's permanently set to infinity. It's about a 35mm equivalent lens. It's a constant f10, so you've got no aperture control, and permanently set to infinity focus. So basically anything from about a meter away from the lens is in focus, and that's all of the control that you have. So because the fact that it's f10, if you're inside, you're basically relying on flash, and with something like the A6400, you've got the built-in flash, which really does emulate the style of flash that you would get on like a disposable camera back in the day, right? So I put this lens on and I snapped a couple of pictures of my daughter, and just immediately was transported back, because these pictures of Juno looked like the pictures of me in my high chair that my dad took in the late 80s. And I think that says a lot about that nostalgic feel. I felt warm and fuzzy looking at these pictures of Juno, because they reminded me of the times that I had when I was a small child. And, when we look back at old family photos, they all have that look. Not out of preference, just out of necessity. That was photography at that time. So for anyone my age, that nostalgic look is perhaps favourable. Not necessarily favourable, maybe that's the wrong word, but it's sort of an interesting aesthetic, because it transports us back to that time of when we were children, or when we were young, or looking at old photos and having that nostalgic feel. So that makes sense. And then the other thing about this lens, which, as I say, it's not a good lens, it's objectively a terrible lens, but I took it out to the seafront and I went for a little photo walk with that lens. And there was something really interesting that happened, because obviously we live in a time where we have so many options at our fingertips when it comes to photography equipment and the ability of our cameras to capture whatever it is we're trying to capture. So leaving the house with my A6400 and nothing but this little plastic lens meant that suddenly I had to think about my photography in a very different way. There were certain shots I couldn't get because I couldn't get close enough to the subject and have focus. I was purely relying on my ISO, which admittedly, even with a disposable camera, in a disposable camera, you'd have had a fixed ISO based on the film that was in it. And a bit of Googling led me to that being either 400 or 800. So when I went out the other day, I sort of set my ISO to 800. And I did allow myself a little bit of leeway. And, I'll be honest, it was not a particularly inspiring day in Worthing seafront that day. It was very grey weather, it was a bit drab, and there weren't a lot of people at the seafront. But I still went out and thought I'd take some nice photos. And there was just a very interesting mind shift that happened where, because I had all of these limitations, it meant I was looking for different photos, different opportunities, and I was shooting in a very different way. And I found it a very immersive experience. And when I got home and I did a bit of editing on these photos to further push that nostalgic feel that I was going for, and I've ended up with a set of photos that I'm actually really pleased with. I think they look nice and they look like they were taken in the 80s, and because of the weather that day and because of the quiet nature of the seafront, I'm looking at the architecture of like the beach huts and stuff, and it does kind of transport you back to a time before now. These photos could have been taken in the 80s for the most part, and there's something kind of like cool about that. But all of this to say that there definitely seems to be a trend towards this nostalgic look. And if you're sort of my age or similar, then the appeal of that look is probably because it reminds you of your childhood, or it reminds you of times gone by. It reminds you of the photos that maybe your parents took of you when you were there. But then in the case of my nephew, he's not old enough to remember that time. So is perhaps the push towards this aesthetic, this grainy film look, and this sort of low contrast, direct flash look, is this actually in his instance just kind of a trend? Is this just a trend that is in vogue at the moment? And I obviously don't have an answer to that, but I thought it was interesting thinking about it. And I just wanted to share my thoughts with you today on that and see what you think about that. But yeah, for something which is essentially utter crap, let's be honest, I've had a lot of fun just sort of playing with it. And certainly some of the images, particularly of my daughter, that I've taken with it have just sort of filled my heart really in a way which I wasn't really expecting. So so this is the Retropia disposable lens. Don't take this as a recommendation, but it is a bit of fun, and it isn't an expensive item. But if you wanted to look at that, and then just having those limitations to shoot in a different way, I found having some limitations pushed my creativity in a way on that particular photo walk. Nostalgia. Why is it that we're looking for that nostalgic look these days? And what does that mean? Just a short one today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.